Just a few days before Christmas, my husband's older brother's ex-wife called to say that they are in town from Texas and wanted her kids to see their cousins, my kids. We had been extremely busy and had many plans between my husband's aggressive chemotherapy treatments and life in general. But I told them that we have 2 hours in between our busy schedules. They came over and we welcomed them and were gracious hosts. The oldest son, Billy, asked about our Christmas lights. I told him that these are Gov lights and how it comes equipped with preset lights for every occasion holiday, and I had been making my own patterns on it. He asked me to show it to him, which I did, but then he asked if he can make some too. I told him no, because last time you had my phone you downloaded a few games and a couple of them had viruses, which my cell phone carrier had put a stop to it. My husband and I have some properties in a property management company. I got a call and walked away to answer it. As I come back to where everyone was seated, Billy grabs the phone out of my hand and I asked him to give it back, but he held the phone away from me. I am 5 foot 7 inches tall and just under 130 pounds versus his 6 foot and over 260 pounds. My husband walked over and grabbed it just as rudely and told him never to grab things out of people's hands. Well, the mother Barb didn't like that. She has said this many times that we don't like to say no to our kids because there are too many no's in the world. Meanwhile, Billy is throwing a temper tantrums while Nick, the second-born, couldn't keep his hands off the candy jar. I got this candy jar that is like a tree with 5 glass jars. I fill it up with colorful candies. I'd sealed it so we don't have a temptation to have some. There were some leftovers that I gave them. They grabbed handfuls and stuffed their pockets with it, so I don't know why he wanted more. Anyway, the candy jars come crashing down and there's glass everywhere. My husband cleaned it all up and I very calmly told Barb that she owes me $300. She was shocked that I asked, because old me would have just gotten over it. But prior to all this, I had gone out and bought Nike brand t-shirts for the 2 older ones and toys for the younger ones. They opened up the gifts and Nick and Billy both said, "Is this all we are getting?" So after the candy crash, I went off on them. Beginning with, "What did you get for my kids?" "A couple of small card games." "Did we say anything about it?" "My kids thanked you and went about to play." They left in a huff because I reminded them that we have prior commitments. Hopefully, never to see them again. Barb left my husband's husband after she lost 80 pounds. My brother-in-law is now deceased. So done with selfish people. Hi there. I live in a small town in the Deep South. I've lived on this corner in my neighborhood for over 25 years. In the last 5 years or so, my neighborhood has really been coming up with very nice new construction. My house was very old and worn out. So in 2021, I tore it down and built a new one in its place. I just moved back in 4 months ago. I'm recently retired local law enforcement and I'm enjoying some well-deserved rest. Last week, I was enjoying watching some reruns on my sofa when my doorbell rang. I quickly checked the camera and saw a white SUV parked out on the street and some middle-aged woman I had never seen before standing at my door. I opened the door to greet her. She introduced herself as Karen, the president of the HOA. I just looked at her. She said she hadn't heard from me about my HOA dues. She said she sent me a couple of letters, then tried my door a few times. I just grinned. I told her I received the letters but threw them away thinking it was a scam. There is no HOA, never has been, and never will be. Clearly, she didn't realize that I am the same guy who lived in the old white cracker house on this same corner. She noticed my fairly thick southern accent and started talking down to me like I was some kind of ignorant bumpkin. Through her condescending smile, she told me that since I am new to the neighborhood, I obviously didn't understand how things work here, and if I didn't bring my delinquent HOA dues up to current, she would put a line against my home, and if I still refused to pay, she could take my house. Then she gave me that arrogant smile again and asked if I could afford to lose my home over a few missed payments. The pleasantness left my face and I moved into that deep, serious voice I developed early in my police career. You just threatened to take my home through illegal means. You are trespassing on my property. You will leave now. If you ever return, I will shoot you where you stand. She started to say something, but I leaned towards her and continued. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you, if you ever step foot on my property again, I will put several holes through your body. You will die right here in front of my door. Now leave. Obviously, I'm not going to shoot some unarmed woman, but she didn't know that. The seriousness of my voice did the trick and frightened her away. She stumbled backwards and very quickly walked back to her SUV. I figured she would call the police, so I sat there watching the camera. I could see her sitting in her SUV talking on the phone. Sure enough, about 5 minutes later, local PD arrived. Did I mention that I'm retired local law enforcement? Many of the local guys trained with me back in the day when I was still in uniform, and most of them worked with me when I was a dep analyst. Yeah, they all know me and know that this is my house. As I watched the camera, I saw the cop get out of his car. It was a friend. Let's call him Bob. I watched as he stood out in the street talking to the frantic Karen. I can only imagine what she was telling him. As I saw him start to approach the house, I stepped outside. Karen began to follow him up my driveway, but I pointed and told her she was not allowed on my property. And now get. Bob turned to tell her to stay back, but my little... Now get. The statement infuriated her, which was the point. She tried to push past Bob, but he grabbed her arm to stop her. She turned and shouted at him to let her go, then slapped Bob in the face. That ended about as well as you'd imagine. Still holding her arm, Bob maneuvered her face down on my driveway and handcuffed her. She was still screaming some rather rude things. By now, I was out by the street with them. I gave Bob a cute smile and asked him if that hurt. He gave me a nasty look and tried not to laugh. All of this commotion had the neighbors out as well. One of the newer neighbors came up to me to ask what was going on with the HOA lady. HOA lady? I asked him to clarify. He said that when he moved in around 8 months ago, she had introduced herself as the HOA president and he had been paying HOA dues to her ever since. Bob overheard this and gave me the look. He got her up and into the back of his patrol car and then called a detective. The detective, we'll call her Shirley, arrived and started taking statements, then started knocking doors in the neighborhood. Apparently, Karen has been scamming most of the newer people in my neighborhood for over a year for HOA dues. She was arrested for battery on law enforcement and resisting arrest, and is awaiting the state attorney's office to build a felony case for her HOA scam. Since she has money and she is not a local and a definite flight risk, she is being held on an insanely high bail. My husband passed away unexpectedly last month. It's honestly the worst thing I've ever had to go through. I'm now a single mom to children aged between 2 and 20. 2 days after my husband passed, she came by but brought her 3 dogs with her, knowing that one of her dogs isn't friendly with children and knowing I also have animals. We had my husband's memorial at a local park where we had been married. I struggled to hold it together, and besides brief hellos, I only spoke to those helping set up, and then I gave my speech. I approached my EM when I saw she had arrived, said hi and let her know my brother was there. Later, I noticed she was gone without even saying goodbye. A few days later, my 20-year-old, he is my stepson who EM has never paid any attention to before, gets a message from her asking him to come stay the week to paint her house. I spoke to my children's therapists who all agree it's too soon after losing their father for their brother who lives with us to be gone for a week. A few of my younger children are autistic. Later that night, I called EM to chat about it and she said, "It's been 3 weeks, you need to get over it." With that, I saw red. I let loose and tell her I'll never be over it. I then threw at her that I noticed that she couldn't be bothered to say goodbye at the memorial, to which she then had a go at me for having my brother there as it made her uncomfortable. I reminded her that that day wasn't about her. I let loose a lot on that phone call. In the end, I hung up the phone. The next morning, I got a call from the police saying that EM had called them and told them that I was trying to end my life. I was lucky as I had spoken to the same officer only 2 days prior, and she told me she got the impression that I'd reach out for help if needed, which is why she chose to call instead of a home visit, which, given my past history, which EM knows about, they would have taken me to hospital as precaution. I've now gone NC with EM. I fully believe, knowing her, that she only invited my son over as she knows he has been one of my base supporters as retaliation for not giving her enough attention at the memorial. After I went NC, I found out that she told my other stepson that she only came because it would have looked bad on her if she didn't. Others also told me she kept yelling at my brother and complaining that I wasn't leaning on her for support. I'm so glad I've gone NC. I was a city bus driver in Detroit for 2 years, and I was warned in advance about the instructor who was a total jerk, and if he gave me, or anyone else, any trouble, to let the mechanics know because they had some dirt on him. Little did I know how much dirt. The instructor's name is, let's just say his name is Melvin. Now, thankfully, I already had my CDL commercial driver license here in the U.S., but not only was he an instructor at the Detroit terminal, but he was also, I found out later on, that he and a few other operators trainers were CDL examiners that were certified by the state of Michigan to ensure that city bus drivers were properly trained inside and out of how to drive a bus, what to do when issues come up. Back to our prima donna jerk teacher. As stated earlier, I already had my CDL from a prior occupation, so I didn't have to train the entire 8 weeks and some change needed to learn the functions of a bus. So for me, the first few weeks were how to have good depth perception, how to handle air brakes, unruly jerk passengers, how to pace myself in traffic, and so on and so forth. This joker here for weeks and months bragged and boasted that he had over 30 years with the company and he could retire right now. And he made way more than the terminal superintendent. I mean, this man made good and sure that you knew that as well. Even after the graduating class that we were in had gotten sworn in and badged whenever the city had established new routes, and we'd go over them in the terminal classrooms, this idiot again put that nonsense in our faces about how much he made and that he could retire right this instant. I thought to myself, first of all, bruh, do you realize that you're constantly bragging about yourself? You're going to sooner or later annoy the wrong people. I mean, not everyone has the abilities and resources that you do. I found out later on during my 2 years with the company that there were operators, dummy term for bus drivers, who made way more than him. They were there just for the BCBS insurance, and I ain't mad either. They just kept lower profiles with their business. Fast forward a year. I haven't been seeing Melvin for the last few months. Thought nothing of it. I assumed he either transferred to another terminal or he'd retired. Well, I was partially right. I'd found out through grapevine that Melvin had gotten rushed by the feds for CDL fraud. Remember, I mentioned that he was not only the senior instructor but also a certified examiner with the state? Well, this man and a retiree were accused and eventually found guilty of issuing false CDLs to students. This had gone on for years. I swear. I'm not making this up. Don't believe me? Google search. Detroit CDL scam. The idiot's name and picture will be the first thing you see in the search. A bloody shame. And the talk about him still goes on today. He faced up to 60 years in prison. But because of his decades of faithful service, and this was his first major offense, they let him quietly retire and was put on probation for a year. Now that is a true slap in the face. I forgot to mention that this scam of his cost his students their CDLs because they were not entirely examined by the state as mandated. And nearly 100 drivers had their licenses revoked. Last I heard, only a fraction of them had gotten re-examined and bounced back from that debacle, which was virtually no fault of their own. He and the retiree pocketed a mere $4,000 cash kickback under the table instead of going by the book. You know what's really sad about this? This man, as intelligent as he was, would stoop so low to do what he did and was willing to endanger the public just to fill his own coffers. He has a son with Crohn's disease, and I did some further digging on Melvin, seeing whether or not that he was the braggadocio prima donna schmuck on a stick he put himself out to be. Not only was he an instructor for a major bus company, he served in the military, was a CDL examiner. He was also a EA, Esquire accountant, with a net worth of $600,000, which explains why he made more than the superintendents at the terminals. Go bloody figure.